The autumn air in Oak Haven, Vermont, on September 8, 1990, carried the sweet, sticky scent of cotton candy and the cheerful din of the town's annual Founders' Day festival. For the community, it was a day of celebration, a final, warm embrace, before the New England fall settled in. But for the Hayes family, it would become the day the music died. 10-year-old Ethan and his 12-year-old sister, Chloe, were the town's little stars. With Ethan's deft fingers on the fiddle and Chloe's soaring voice, they were a duo that could charm the sternest of faces. Their harmonies a perfect, innocent blend. They had just finished their third and final set on the rickety wooden stage in the town square, the applause of their neighbors and friends still echoing in the twilight. Their mother, Sarah Hayes, watched from the front row, her heart swelling with a familiar pride. She remembered the scuffed-up case Ethan first carried his grandfather's fiddle in, the countless hours Chloe spent humming melodies in her room, a hairbrush for a microphone. Today, they looked so grown up under the twinkling festival lights, their faces flushed with the joy of performance. Their father, Mark, stood by the sound equipment, giving them a proud thumbs up. He was their roadie, their sound engineer, their biggest fan, all rolled into one. It was a perfect family moment, crystallized in time, bathed in the golden glow of a day that promised nothing but happiness. After their performance, flushed with excitement and clutching the $5 bills pressed into their hands by adoring locals, the children begged for one last hour of freedom. They wanted to ride the Ferris wheel one more time, to share a final bag of greasy salt-dusted fries. Sarah and Mark hesitated for only a moment. In Oak Haven, danger was a foreign concept, a headline from a faraway city. They knew every face in the crowd. Be back at the car by 9. Not a minute later, Mark called out, his voice firm but loving. The children, their bright costumes, a blur of sequins and denim, cheered and raced off toward the vibrant heart of the Midway dot. Sarah watched them go, a small, unexplainable shiver tracing a line down her spine despite the mild evening. She saw Ethan's fiery red hair, a beacon, disappear behind the Guess Your Weight booth. She saw Chloe turn back for a split second, her smile as bright as the string of lights above her, and wave. It was a fleeting image, a photograph burned into her memory that would later become a source of unending torment. That single, carefree wave was the last time she would ever see her daughter. It was the final, silent note of their song. As the clock ticked past 9, the initial flicker of parental annoyance slowly morphed into a cold, creeping dread. Mark walked the perimeter of the festival grounds, his long strides eating up the space between the game stalls and food vendors. Sarah stayed by the car, her gaze fixed on the path from the Midway, praying to see their familiar silhouettes emerge from the throng of departing families. The cheerful festival music now seemed mocking, a tinny, hollow soundtrack to her mounting panic. Every glimpse of a red-haired boy or a girl in a sparkling vest sent a jolt through her, a cycle of hope and crushing disappointment that repeated with every passing minute. By 9:30 p.m., the panic had fully bloomed, choking and absolute. Mark returned, his face pale, his earlier confidence shattered. "They're not there," he whispered, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. "I've checked everywhere. Sarah, the Ferris wheel operator, the food stalls, ... Nobody's seen them for at least an hour." The world tilted on its axis for Sarah. The scent of popcorn and sugar suddenly became nauseating. The distant laughter of other people's children felt like a physical blow, a cruel reminder of the two voices that were now terrifyingly silent. The initial report to the Oak Haven Police Department was treated with a calm professionalism that felt jarringly out of sync with the Hayes' internal chaos. An officer with a kind, weary face took down the details. Chloe Hayes, 12, last seen wearing a denim jacket with silver sequins on the shoulders. Ethan Hayes, 10, in a red flannel shirt and blue jeans, likely carrying his fiddle case. The officer assured them that children often lost track of time at festivals, that they would surely turn up at a friend's house. But in their hearts, Sarah and Mark knew this was different. Their children were responsible, always punctual. The perfect, harmonious rhythm of their family life had been broken. The search began in earnest as the last of the festival goers trickled out, leaving behind a field of discarded cups and trampled grass. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, dancing over empty tents and the skeletal frames of the packed-up rides. The vibrant, joyful space of just hours before had transformed into a desolate crime scene. Each discarded toy or piece of clothing found on the ground sent a fresh wave of terror through Sarah. The night grew colder, the silence deeper, broken only by the crackle of police radios and the frantic, whispered prayers of two parents stranded. In a waking nightmare, one key witness emerged from the initial canvas, an elderly woman who ran the candy apple stand. She remembered the children vividly. She recalled them stopping by, their faces bright with excitement. But she also remembered a man lingering nearby, watching them. He was a performer, one of the roving magicians who worked the crowd for tips. He had a wide, painted-on smile and a deck of cards he handled with practiced ease. He had even performed a simple trick for Chloe and Ethan, making a coin disappear and then finding it behind Ethan's ear. The magician, the police, had a name: Smiling Jack Bennett, a traveling entertainer from a neighboring state. He wasn't on the official roster of festival performers, just an independent artist who had shown up to work the crowd. By the time investigators went to question him, his van was gone from the designated performer parking lot. He had vanished as completely as the two children he was last seen with. As the first light of dawn broke over Oakhaven, it illuminated a town gripped by fear and a family shattered by a silence that would stretch on for nearly 3 decades. The days following the disappearance of Chloe and Ethan Hayes bled into a week of agonizing, fruitless searching. The small Oakhaven Police Department was quickly overwhelmed, and state investigators were called in to assist. The festival grounds were cordoned off, a yellow-taped monument to the town's stolen innocence. Search parties, composed of grim-faced volunteers and uniformed officers, combed every inch of the surrounding woods and fields. The rustling of leaves under their boots, the snap of a twig every sound was a potential clue, a potential heartbreak. The children's faces, captured in a recent school photograph, stared out from flyers stapled to every telephone pole and taped to every storefront window. Detective Miles Corbin, a young, ambitious officer on his first major case, felt the weight of the town's collective hope and fear on his shoulders. He was the one who interviewed the candy apple vendor, who first heard the name Smiling Jack Bennett. Corbin spent hours in the makeshift incident room, the walls covered with maps, timelines, and photographs of the smiling vanished children. He could smell the stale coffee and the low hum of anxiety that permeated the station. He felt a personal, burning need to find them, to restore the sense of order that had been so brutally ripped away. The focus of the investigation quickly centered on Jack Bennett. A bowler on the lookout was issued for his battered blue Ford Econoline van. His photograph, a grainy DMV picture showing a man with hollow eyes that betrayed his stage name, was circulated to law enforcement agencies across New England. Detectives discovered he was a drifter, a man who lived on the fringes, moving from town to town. His life a transient blur of cheap motels and small-time gigs. He had no fixed address, no close family, leaving behind a trail that was frustratingly thin and cold. Sarah and Mark Hayes existed in a fog of suspended animation. Their home, once filled with the sounds of fiddle practice and off-key singing, was now suffocatingly quiet. The silence was a physical presence, a constant reminder of the gaping hole that had been torn in their lives. Friends and neighbors brought casseroles and offered whispered condolences, their kindness a painful balm on an open wound. Sarah would spend hours in Chloe's room, touching the frilly bedspread, smelling the faint scent of strawberry shampoo on her pillow. Mark would stand in the garage, his hand resting on the spare fiddle strings he'd bought for Ethan just last week. The media descended on Oakhaven, their satellite trucks lining the quiet residential streets. The story of the missing musical prodigies was a compelling one, and for a time, Chloe and Ethan were national news. The Hayeses gave a single gut-wrenching press conference, pleading for the safe return of their children. Sarah's voice broke as she clutched Ethan's favorite stuffed bear, while Mark stood stoically beside her, his face a mask of stone that couldn't quite hide the tremor in his hands. They spoke to a camera, but their words were a desperate prayer sent out to the man with the painted-on smile. As the weeks turned into a month, the national media moved on to the next tragedy, the next headline. The search parties grew smaller, the volunteers returning to their own lives, their own children. The flyers on the telephone poles began to fade and curl, the smiling faces of Chloe and Ethan slowly bleached by the autumn sun. For the Hayes family, this fading attention was a second, deeper kind of agony. It felt as if the world was forgetting their children, allowing them to slip away not once, but twice. The silence from law enforcement was just as deafening. Detective Corbin, however, did not forget. The case files for Chloe and Ethan Hayes were no longer on the main briefing board, but they sat on the corner of his desk, a constant, reproachful presence. He chased down every lead, no matter how tenuous. He followed up on reported sightings of Bennett's van in 3 different states, each one a dead end. He interviewed other traveling performers, building a psychological profile of a lonely, awkward man who seemed to crave the attention of children because he was unable to connect with adults. The man they described was a far cry from the cheerful, smiling Jack. The first snow of winter fell on Oakhaven, blanketing the town in a pristine, silent white. For the Hayeses, it was a brutal milestone. Thanksgiving passed with 2 empty chairs. At the table, Christmas approached, a season of joy that now felt like a cruel mockery. They couldn't bring themselves to put up a tree or hang the stockings that Chloe had so carefully labeled in glitter glue years before. Their grief was a landscape, vast and frozen, with no sign of a thaw. They were no longer living, merely existing in the unending winter of their loss. A potential break came in early December. A hunter deep in the Green Mountains discovered an abandoned campsite, hastily deserted. Among the scattered debris, empty bean cans and a tattered sleeping bag was a single custom-made guitar pick, embossed with a small, smiling clown face. It was the same type of pick that Jack Bennett was known to use for his limited guitar-playing bits. A forensic team swept the area, but found nothing more. There was no sign of the children, no sign of Bennett. It was just a ghost of a clue, a whisper in the woods that led nowhere. By the 1-year anniversary of the disappearance, the case of Chloe and Ethan Hayes was officially declared cold. The incident room was dismantled, the maps and photos taken down and filed away in a cardboard box labeled Hayes, C&E, unsolved. For Detective Corbin, it felt like a personal failure. For Sarah and Mark, it was the official acknowledgement of their worst fear. Their children were gone, and the world was moving on. The stage in the town square was empty, and the silence it held was a promise that had been broken. An encore that would never come. Years bled into one another, each one layering a fresh coat of dust on the cold case file of Chloe and Ethan Hayes. In the wider world, life marched on. The 1990s gave way to a new millennium. Technology surged forward, creating a world of instant communication and information that had been science fiction on the day the children vanished. But for Sarah and Mark Hayes, time had effectively stopped that September evening. They remained in Oakhaven, trapped in a town that was a constant, living memorial to their loss. Every corner, every street held a ghost. The Hayes marriage, once a duet of shared dreams and laughter, fractured under the immense, unrelenting pressure of their grief. They mourned in different ways. Sarah became a fierce advocate for missing children, channeling her pain into action, founding a local chapter of a national support group. Mark retreated inward, the silence that had consumed their home eventually consuming him as well. They were 2 people adrift in the same storm, their lifeboats tied together but unable to reach one another. The divorce was quiet, amicable, and utterly heartbreaking, another casualty of Jack Bennett's crime. Detective Miles Corbin rose through the ranks of the Vermont State Police. He became Captain Corbin, a man respected for his tenacity and his solemn, empathetic demeanor. He married, had children of his own, and solved dozens of other cases. Yet, the Hayes case remained an open wound, a failure that defined him more than any success. Every September 8th, he would pull the dusty box from the archives, spread the faded photographs across his desk, and stare into the innocent eyes of Chloe and Ethan, silently renewing a promise he feared he could never keep. And what of smiling Jack Bennett? The man who had evaporated from a festival parking lot seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. The initial bolo had yielded nothing. His van was never found. For years, he was a phantom, a name in a file. But then, around the turn of the century, a new face began to appear on a fledgling public access channel in the Midwest. It was a children's entertainer, the host of a low-budget show called Sonny's Funhouse. The host's name was Jim Franklin. Franklin, or Sonny Jim as he was known to his small but growing audience, was a portly, cheerful man with a contagious laugh and a knack for silly puppets. He was an instant hit with children. He had a gentle, grandfatherly presence that put both kids and parents at ease. The show was simple. songs, goofy skits, and a segment where Sunny Jim would read birthday cards on air. His signature was a warm, beaming smile and the phrase, "Remember kids, be a little ray of sunshine for someone today." Over the next decade, Sunny's Funhouse experienced a meteoric rise. It was picked up by a national cable network, and Sunny Jim Franklin became a household name. His face was on lunchboxes, his catchphrase on t-shirts. He wrote children's books that became bestsellers. He was a beloved figure, an icon of wholesome family entertainment, a modern-day Mr. Rogers. No one ever connected the genial television host with the grainy DMV photo of the hollow-eyed drifter named Jack Bennett. He had shed his old skin completely. The irony was grotesque, a secret horror hidden in plain sight. While the Hayes family and Detective Corbin were trapped in the past, the man responsible for their torment was building a celebrated career on the very innocence he had destroyed. He was hiding in the one place no one would ever think to look, directly in the spotlight. His success was his camouflage. The warmth and trust he projected on screen was a perfect shield, deflecting any possible suspicion. On the rare occasion a journalist would ask about his life before Sunny's Funhouse, Jim Franklin had a well-rehearsed vague story. He spoke of a difficult, lonely childhood and years spent finding himself. While traveling the country, he would frame it as a journey that led him to his true calling, bringing joy to children. He claimed the name Jim Franklin was a stage name he adopted to honor his two favorite uncles. It was a plausible, heartwarming narrative that no one had any reason to doubt. As the years passed, Jim Franklin aged on screen. His hair turned from brown to gray, and his laugh lines deepened. He became an institution. He won daytime television awards and was praised for his gentle wisdom and his unwavering dedication to children's well-being. He was invited to speak at educational conferences and charity events. He was, by all accounts, a model citizen, a pillar of the community, a man who had brought light into the lives of millions. In the fall of 2019, nearly 29 years after Chloe and Ethan Hayes vanished into the twilight, the network announced a primetime special to celebrate Sunny Jim's upcoming retirement. It was billed as an evening of nostalgia and celebration, a look back at the career of a television legend. Interviews were lined up with network executives, former child actors from his show, and the man himself. In Oak Haven, Sarah Hayes prepared to mark another grim anniversary. In his office, a gray-haired Captain Corbin looked at the two faded faces on his desk. And in a television studio in Los Angeles, Jim Franklin prepared to give the performance of his life. The television studio was buzzing with a palpable energy on the evening of October 15, 2019. The set for the retirement special, Sunny Farewell, was designed to look like a cozy living room, filled with memorabilia from Jim Franklin's long career. The iconic Sunny's Funhouse sign hung in the background, its bright yellow letters a beacon of nostalgia. The live studio audience was filled with adoring fans who had grown up with his show, their faces alight with a mixture of reverence and sadness at his departure. The air was thick with the scent of fresh paint and the hum of the powerful studio lights. The host of the special, a sharp and charismatic journalist named Isabella Vance, sat across from Jim Franklin. She began the interview with a warm, effusive introduction, listing his many accolades and contributions to children's television. Jim, looking frail and much older than his 68 years, offered a weak but familiar smile. He was dressed in his signature cardigan, but his usual boisterous energy was absent. His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them in his lap, a detail the cameras thankfully didn't capture. The interview started smoothly, following a predictable path. They played clips from the early days of Sunny's Funhouse, showing a much younger Jim Franklin engaging in slapstick comedy with his puppets. The audience laughed and applauded on cue. Jim shared heartwarming anecdotes about funny moments on set and the thousands of letters he received from children over the years. He spoke of the immense privilege it had been to be a part of so many families' lives. It was all going exactly as planned, a flawless tribute to a beloved icon. Isabella Vance then guided the conversation toward a more personal note. "Jim," she said, her tone gentle, "you've brought so much light to others, but you've always been very private about your own life before the show. You've mentioned a long journey to find yourself. Looking back, what was the moment that truly set you on this path? What was the turning point?" It was a standard, introspective question, designed to elicit a thoughtful, heartwarming response for the final segment. Strange quiet fell over Jim Franklin. His folksy smile faltered, then vanished completely. He stared past Isabella, his eyes fixing on the red light of camera 1, as if it were the only thing in the universe. The audience shifted uncomfortably, the silence stretching for an long time. The control room crackled with nervous energy. The director's voice, tight with anxiety, whispered into Isabella's earpiece, "Is he okay? Go to a commercial if you need to." But Isabella, a seasoned professional, held her ground, sensing that something momentous was about to happen. When Jim finally spoke, his voice was a dry, rasping whisper, a chilling departure from his familiar, booming baritone. A turning point, he repeated, the words hollow. He took a shaky breath. There was a day, a long time ago. I wasn't Sonny Jim then. I had a different name. Isabella's eyes widened slightly. This was not in the pre-interview notes. The director was now screaming into her earpiece to cut away, but it was too late. Jim Franklin leaned forward, his eyes boring into the camera lens, into the millions of homes watching across the country. "My name was Jack Bennett," he said, the words dropping like stones into the stunned silence of the studio. "In September of 1990, I was working as a magician at a festival in Oak Haven, Vermont." At the mention of Oak Haven, a collective gasp went through the control room. In his quiet home office, Captain Miles Corbin, who had been half watching the special, shot upright in his chair, his heart pounding against his ribs. The remote clattered to the floor as he stared, mesmerized, at the screen. "There were 2 children," Jim Franklin continued, his voice cracking with a pain that was terrifyingly real. "A brother and a sister, Chloe and Ethan Hayes. They were musicians, so beautiful, so full of life." Tears began to stream down his face, not the gentle, heartwarming tears of a nostalgic old man, but the racking, soul-tearing sobs of the damned. "They watched my show. I made a coin disappear for them, and then and then I made them disappear." The confession hung in the air, stark and monstrous. The audience was frozen, a sea of shocked, disbelieving faces. Isabella Vance was paralyzed, her journalistic instincts warring with pure, unadulterated shock. She could hear the chaos erupting in her earpiece, but she couldn't move, couldn't speak. On screen, Jim Franklin was unraveling completely. "I took them," he cried out, his voice raw. "Their mother and father told them to be back by 9, but they never went back. They came with me. I promised them a real magic show, a private show." The raw, unfiltered horror of his words, broadcast live into living rooms across America, was absolute. In her small home, Sarah Hayes, who had been channel surfing, landed on the special just moments before. She saw the face of the man who had entertained millions, the man who was now speaking her children's names. She heard his words, and the world dissolved into a roaring blackness. The teacup she was holding slipped from her grasp and shattered. On the floor, the sound lost in her own scream. 29 years of silent, suffocating grief had just been ripped open by a confession that was more horrific than any nightmare she had ever imagined. The show cut abruptly to a black screen, but the damage was done. The secret was out. The moment the broadcast cut to black, chaos erupted. In the Los Angeles studio, the live audience sat in stunned, horrified silence for a beat before a wave of panicked murmurs and shouts swept through the room. Security guards rushed the stage, not knowing if Jim Franklin was a threat to himself or others. Isabella Vance, shaking, finally found her voice, speaking urgently into her still-live microphone to the control room. "Call 911, now." The celebrated farewell special had instantaneously become the site of the most public murder confession in media history. 200 miles away, in Oak Haven, the sound of Sarah Hayes' scream was followed by the frantic ringing of her phone. It was Mark, his voice choked with a frantic energy she hadn't heard in decades. "Sarah, did you see? Are you watching?" He was babbling, the words tumbling out in a torrent of shock and disbelief. They barely spoke anymore, but in that single, horrifying moment, the chasm that had grown between them over 29 years was bridged by a shared, electrifying horror. The ghost that had haunted their separate lives had just been given a name and a face on national television. At the Vermont State Police headquarters, Captain Miles Corbin was already in motion. He yelled for his deputy to get the district attorney on the line as he simultaneously dialed the LAPD. His mind was a whirlwind, connecting the dots with a speed born of 3 decades of frustrated waiting. Jim Franklin was Jack Bennett. The beloved TV host was the transient magician. The man who taught children to be rays of sunshine was a predator who had stolen the light from two of them. The absurdity of it was matched only by its profound wickedness. The dusty, cold case of Chloe and Ethan Hayes was now white-hot. The news cycle ignited. The clip of Jim Franklin's confession went viral within minutes. A firestorm of shared links, shocked emojis, and frantic online commentary. Sunny Jim Killer became a trending topic worldwide. News vans that had been parked outside the studio to report on a heartwarming retirement special were now broadcasting breaking news of a stunning murder confession. The stark contrast between Franklin's public persona and his confessed crime was a story almost too sensational to be believed, yet millions had witnessed it firsthand. Back in the studio, a now catatonic Jim Franklin was gently escorted off the set by bewildered police officers. The painted-on smile he wore for decades had melted away, revealing the hollowed-out shell of a man beneath. He offered no resistance, his body limp, as if the act of confession had drained him of his very life force. As they led him through the chaotic backstage area, past stunned crew members and weeping fans, he seemed to shrink, the larger-than-life TV personality disappearing completely, leaving only a frail, pathetic old man in a cardigan. The official interrogation began a few hours later, in a sterile, windowless room at an LAPD precinct. Miles Corbin was patched in via video conference, his face a grim, determined mask on the screen. The initial part of the confession was a rambling, almost incoherent monologue. Franklin, no longer Sunny Jim but Jack Bennett once more, spoke of a deep, pervasive loneliness that had plagued him his entire life. He confessed that the adoration of his young fans was a drug, a temporary fix for the emptiness inside him, an emptiness that had turned monstrous on that September night in 1990. He explained the reason for his sudden confession: terminal diagnosis, pancreatic cancer, he stated, with only a few months left to live. "I couldn't meet my maker with this secret," he rasped, his voice thin and reedy. "I built a lie, a big, sunny lie, but the foundation was buried in the dark." He claimed he wanted to give the family the only thing he had left to give: the truth. It was a selfish, last-ditch attempt at salvation, a final performance for an audience of one. But for the investigators, it was the key they had been missing for a generation. The confession sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. The network that aired Sunny's Funhouse immediately pulled all reruns and issued a statement of profound shock and disgust. Merchandising companies ceased production of his books and toys. Colleagues who had known him for years gave interviews, their faces etched with disbelief. How could the man who organized charity drives for sick children, who was famously gentle and kind to every child on his set, be capable of such a monstrous act? The question hung over Hollywood like a shroud. For Sarah and Mark Hayes, the confession was a brutal, double-edged sword. On one hand, the not knowing the torment of endless possibility that had haunted their every waking moment was over. They finally knew who had taken their children, but that knowledge came with a fresh, visceral wave of horror. Their children's last moments had been with this man, this wolf in sheep's clothing. Every clip of Sunny's Funhouse they had ever passively watched over the years now felt like a personal, sickening betrayal. The most critical part of the confession was yet to come. Corbin, his voice steady and cold, cut through Bennett's rambling justifications. "Where are they, Jack?" he asked, the sound echoing in the small interrogation room. "After 29 years, it's not enough to know who. We need to know where. Where are Chloe and Ethan?" Bennett fell silent, his eyes closing as if in pain. The echo of his public confession had shaken the world, but for the family and the detective who never gave up, the only thing that mattered now was bringing the children home. The answer would lie buried, not just in Bennett's memory, but in the dark, Vermont soil. The day after the confession, Captain Miles Corbin was on a red-eye flight from Vermont to Los Angeles. The landscape of his 30-year career had been irrevocably altered in the span of a single television interview. Sitting in the cramped airplane seat, the hum of the engines a monotonous drone, he felt a strange mixture of vindication and profound dread. He was finally face to face with the man who had haunted his professional life, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come. He had to extract not just a story, but a location, a final resting place. The second interrogation was different. Jack Bennett, now stripped of his Sunny Jim persona and clad in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, seemed smaller, almost insignificant. The bravado of his public confession had evaporated, replaced by a weary resignation. Corbin sat across from him, the cold metal table a stark barrier between them. He didn't begin with accusations or anger. He began by placing a photograph on the tabular photo of Chloe and Ethan, taken at the festival just hours before they vanished. It was bright, happy, and full of life. Bennett flinched as if struck. He couldn't look at the picture. "They trusted me," he whispered, his gaze fixed on his shackled hands. Corbin let the silence hang in the air, a heavy, tactical weight. "They did," Corbin said, his voice even. "They were good kids, Jack. They deserved to grow up. They deserved to come home." He pushed the photo a little closer. "You took that away. Now, you're going to give them back to their parents. You're going to tell me where they are." Guided by Corbin's relentless, patient questioning, Bennett began to sketch out the horrific events of that night. He spoke of luring the children away from the bustling Midway with the promise of seeing a real magic trick, one too big for the festival stage. Their childish excitement and trust were the keys he used to unlock their doom. He led them away from the lights and the crowds, down a secluded path to where he had parked his nondescript blue van, a vehicle that served as his home, his transport, and, ultimately, his prison for the children. The details were mundane. He told them the van was his magical workshop. He offered them sodas, which he had drugged with sleeping pills he'd bought over the counter. He watched as Ethan, the younger one, fell asleep first, his head slumping against the worn passenger seat. Chloe, older and more suspicious, fought the drowsiness for a few minutes before she too succumbed. The image he painted was one of profound, calculated betrayal, a predator using his craft to ensnare the most vulnerable. He drove for hours, he confessed, winding through the dark, rural backroads of Vermont with no clear destination in mind. He was panicked, the reality of what he had done crashing down on him. The children were not props in a magic act. They were real, and he had stolen them. He eventually found his way to a place he vaguely remembered from a previous trip, an old, abandoned property he had stumbled upon while looking for a quiet place to camp. It was miles from anywhere, a forgotten corner of the state. With a trembling hand, Bennett took the pen and paper offered by Corbin and began to draw a crude map. He sketched the layout of a dilapidated farmhouse, a collapsing barn, and a root cellar set into a small hill behind the main house. "The cellar," he said, his voice barely audible. It had a heavy wooden door. It was cold inside, smelled of damp earth and decay. He described, in halting, agonizing detail, how he had carried the sleeping children down the stone steps. The motive, as it finally spilled out, was as pathetic as it was evil. He hadn't planned to kill them. He claimed he just wanted to keep them, to have their light and their talent for himself. He was a failed performer, a lonely man who craved the adoration they received so effortlessly. He had intended to create a fantasy world for them in the isolated farmhouse, a funhouse of his own making. But when they awoke, they were terrified. They cried for their parents. Their fear shattered his delusion, and in a fit of panic and rage to silence their screams, he had smothered them. The map was his final confession, a guide to the tomb he had created. He drew an X on the floor of the cellar sketch. "Under the dirt floor," he said, his body shaking with silent sobs. "I buried them together. I put Ethan's fiddle in with them." The detail was an act of final, twisted sentimentality, a detail that ripped through Miles Corbin with the force of a physical blow. He had spent his career searching for clues, and the most important one of all was the location of a little boy's instrument. With the map secured in a sealed evidence bag, Corbin felt no triumph, only a profound, soul-crushing sadness. He had the truth, he had the location, but it was a victory that felt entirely like a defeat. He now had to make the call to Sarah and Mark Hayes and tell them that the search for their children was finally over, but that the nightmare was about to enter its most horrific, final chapter. The monster had provided his map, and now they had to go and follow it into the dark. A wave of cold, damp air, thick with the smell of wet leaves and decay, met Captain Miles Corbin and his team as they arrived at the abandoned property. It was located deep in the Green Mountain National Forest, accessible only by a long-forgotten and overgrown logging road. The property was exactly as Jack Bennett had described it on his crude map, a skeletal farmhouse, its windows like vacant eyes, and a listing barn that looked as if a strong gust of wind would reduce it to a pile of rotten timber. The late autumn sky was a bleak, unforgiving gray. casting the entire scene in a pall of sorrow. The entire area was declared a major crime scene. Yellow tape was strung between the skeletal trees, a stark, artificial barrier against the wild, untamed nature. A mobile command center was set up, its generators humming in the otherwise silent woods. Forensic vans and police cruisers crowded the narrow road. For Corbin, stepping onto this land felt like stepping into a tomb. He had spent 29 years imagining where Chloe and Ethan might be. But the grim reality of this desolate place was worse than anything his mind had conjured. Sarah Hayes and Mark Hayes arrived separately, but stood together. A few hundred yards from the police line, they were offered a seat inside a heated vehicle, but both refused, choosing instead to bear witness from the cold. They stood side by side, a silent, unified front of grief, their personal differences erased by the gravity of the moment. They watched as the forensic team, dressed in white Tyvek suits, began their methodical work, their movements precise and respectful amidst the grim landscape. Each snap of a camera, each quiet command, echoed in the funereal quiet. The focus of the operation was the root cellar Bennett had marked on his map. It was set into the side of a small, grassy hill, its heavy wooden door rotted and hanging from a single, rusted hinge. The entrance was choked with weeds and debris that had accumulated over 3 decades. 2 officers had to use pry bars to force the door open. The screech of protesting would a painful sound in the stillness. As the door swung open, it revealed a set of steep stone steps leading down into absolute darkness. A palpable sense of dread settled over the entire team. Powerful lights were brought in, illuminating the cellar's interior. It was small, no more than 10 by 12 feet, with damp stone walls that glistened with moisture. The air was frigid and heavy with the cloying, unmistakable smell of cold earth. The floor was uneven dirt, littered with broken jars and the remnants of old wooden shelves. It was a place of forgotten things, a space designed for preserving roots and vegetables, now repurposed as a crypt for stolen innocence. The team stood at the top of the steps for a long moment, gathering themselves before descending into the grave. That the forensic excavation began with an almost archaeological reverence. The team sectioned off the floor into a grid, following the X on Bennett's map. They used small trowels and brushes, scraping away the dirt, inch by agonizing inch. The work was slow, meticulous, and emotionally draining. Every scrape of metal on stone sent a shiver through the onlookers. For Sarah and Mark, every minute that passed was an eternity, a slow-motion unraveling of the final, terrible truth. They held on to each other, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles were white. After nearly 2 hours of painstaking work, one of the technicians stopped. He gently brushed away a final layer of soil, and the searchers saw it, a piece of dark, polished wood. As more dirt was carefully cleared, the unmistakable shape of a musical instrument began to emerge. It was the scroll and tuning pegs of a small violin. A collective, sorrowful breath was drawn by everyone present. It was Ethan's fiddle, the one he had clutched so proudly on the festival stage. Bennett had told the truth. The discovery of the fiddle confirmed they were in the right place, and the excavation proceeded with even greater caution. Shortly after, they found the first of the human remains. It was a small piece of fabric, the faded denim of a jacket, and then, nestled beside it, the delicate bones of a child's hand. The lead forensic anthropologist quietly confirmed the discovery. The search was over. Chloe and Ethan Hayes had been found. A profound, heart-wrenching silence fell over the forest, broken only by a single, sharp cry from Sarah. The recovery process took the rest of the day. The remains of the 2 children were carefully, lovingly exhumed from the shallow grave where they had lain for 29 years. They were wrapped in white sheets and carried with solemn dignity up the stone steps and out into the fading light. The sight of the 2 small, shrouded forms being placed into the back of the coroner's vehicle was the final, brutal confirmation of a loss that had, until now, existed only in the realm of abstraction. It was real. They were gone. As the vehicles began to depart, leaving the haunted property to the encroaching darkness, Miles Corbin walked over to Sarah and Mark. He had no words of comfort that could possibly suffice. He simply stood before them, his own face a mask of grief. "We have them," he said softly. "We're bringing them home." In that moment, there was no relief, no sense of victory or closure. There was only the cold, hard, and unforgiving earth of Vermont. which had finally given up its most tragic secret. The discovery in the root cellar shifted the focus of the case from a search for the missing to a prosecution of the guilty. With the remains of Chloe and Ethan Hayes recovered, the district attorney's office began building an ironclad case against Jack Bennett. The confession, while powerful, needed to be supported by the grim physical evidence unearthed from the cold Vermont soil. The entire narrative now pivoted to deconstructing the life of the man known as Sunny Jim. To understand the psychology of a monster who had hidden behind a mask of kindness for so long, forensic analysis of the remains confirmed their identities through dental records, which Sarah and Mark had painfully provided years ago. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, consistent with Bennett's confession of smothering them. Fibers found with the remains were matched to the upholstery of his 1988 Ford Econoline van, a vehicle he admitted to having dismantled and sold 4 scrap metal parts across 3 states a year after the murders. Every piece of evidence was another nail in his legal coffin. Criminal psychologists were brought in to analyze Bennett's life and his confession. They painted a portrait of a man with deep-seated narcissistic personality disorder and a profound inferiority complex. His entire life had been a performance. Born into a neglectful home, he was an awkward, lonely child who discovered that simple magic tricks could garner him the attention and validation he craved, but it was a hollow victory. He wasn't being celebrated for who he was, but for the illusions he created. This dynamic became the defining pattern of his life. His Sunny Jim persona was not just a disguise. It was the ultimate illusion. He had meticulously crafted a character who was everything he was not: warm, beloved, successful, and confident. By hosting Sunny's Funhouse, he was able to bathe in the unconditional adoration of children, the one audience he felt he could control and impress. It was a carefully constructed reality built to insulate him from his own feelings of worthlessness and failure. The lie wasn't just for the public, it was for himself. The investigation delved into his past, uncovering the trail of a transient life lived on the margins. They found records of petty theft arrests in his youth, and interviews with other performers from the 90s who described him as creepy and desperate. One former acquaintance recalled Bennett becoming fixated on a family of young gymnasts, offering them free lessons and trying to ingratiate himself with their parents before being warned away. A clear pattern of predatory obsession with talented, innocent children began to emerge from the shadows of his past. The children he had on his show, now adults, were interviewed. Their reactions were a mixture of horror and disbelief. Many recalled Sunny Jim as a kind, if slightly distant, figure, but a few remembered unsettling moments. One former child actor, now a woman in her 30s, recalled how Jim would insist on giving her piggyback rides, even when she felt she was too old, his embrace lasting a little too long. Another remembered him becoming strangely angry and sullen when a skit went wrong. These were small, dissonant notes in the happy melody of the show, hints of the darkness that lay beneath the surface. The most chilling part of the psychological analysis was Bennett's motivation for the murders. He hadn't just wanted to silence Chloe and Ethan. In his twisted mind, by killing them, he could possess their talent and innocence forever. He had stolen their light and tried to absorb it into himself. The act of burying Ethan's fiddle with him was seen by experts not as an act of sentimentality, but as a symbolic act of ownership. He was ensuring that the music belonged only to him, buried in his secret place. In Oak Haven, the community reeled from the confirmation of their worst fears. The story of Smiling Jack, the magician from the festival, had become a local ghost story, a cautionary tale told to children. To learn that he had been hiding in plain sight, celebrated and adored, was a profound shock. It spoke to a terrifying truth, that evil doesn't always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes, it wears a cardigan and a warm, sunny smile. The town's collective sense of safety, shattered in 1990, was now ground into dust. For Sarah and Mark Hayes, learning the why was a new form of torture. The idea that their children were murdered not out of simple malice, but as part of a disturbed individual's psychological fantasy, was almost impossible to comprehend. Sarah, in particular, was tormented by the knowledge that the man who killed her children had built a career on the very joy and innocence he had extinguished in them. Every time his face appeared on the news, it was a fresh stab of a poisoned knife. The anatomy of the lie was complete. Jack Bennett was a hollow man who had created a beloved character as a vessel to contain his darkness. He had lived for years in a carefully constructed world of sunshine and puppets, all while the memory of 2 children lay buried in the cold Vermont earth. With the trial approaching, the world would soon see the mask fully removed, revealing the pathetic, empty, and evil reality that had lurked behind the sunny smile all along. The trial of Jack Bennett, held in the spring of 2020, was a media spectacle. It was moved to Burlington, Vermont's largest city, to accommodate the intense public and press interest. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They began with the grainy footage of the on-air confession, a moment of high drama that had the entire courtroom mesmerized. They followed it with the cold, hard science of the forensic evidence, DNA, dental records, and fiber analysis that linked Bennett to the children and the burial site with irrefutable certainty. Captain Miles Corbin, now on the verge of retirement, was the prosecution's star witness. On the stand, he recounted the entire history of the case, from the initial panicked report at the Oak Haven Festival to the grim discovery in the root cellar. He spoke with a quiet authority, his testimony a 30-year narrative of frustration, dedication, and eventual, tragic resolution. When he identified Bennett in the courtroom, he looked directly at the man who had haunted his career, his gaze, steady and unwavering. It was the culmination of his life's work. Bennett's defense team, facing a mountain of evidence and a televised confession, had an impossible task. Their strategy was not to prove innocence, but to argue for a lesser charge. They portrayed Bennett as a mentally disturbed and deeply remorseful man who had snapped under the pressure of his own pathologies. They argued that the killings were not premeditated but the result of a panicked, spontaneous act. They put a psychiatrist on the stand who spoke of Bennett's severe personality disorders, framing him as a victim of his own broken mind. Sarah Hayes took the stand to give a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in stunned, tearful silence. She did not speak with rage, but with a profound, soul-deep weariness. She spoke of the silence in her house, the phantom sounds of a fiddle and a young girl's laughter that she still heard in her dreams. She held up a photograph of Chloe and Ethan, their smiles radiant, and addressed Bennett directly. "You didn't just kill 2 children," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You killed a family. You killed the people we were and the people we were supposed to become." Mark Hayes also spoke, his words fewer but just as powerful. He talked about Ethan's love for his grandfather's fiddle and Chloe's dream of singing. On a real Broadway stage, he described the simple, everyday moments that had been stolen from them. Proms, graduations, weddings, grandchildren. His testimony was a quiet, heartbreaking catalogue of a life that never was. He looked at the jury, his eyes filled with a pain that 30 years had not dulled, and asked them to remember that the case was not about a television host, but about 2 real children who deserved justice. Jack Bennett himself chose not to testify. He sat at the defense table each day, a shrunken, gray figure in a suit that seemed too large for him. He rarely looked up, his gaze mostly fixed on the floor. During Sarah's testimony, his shoulders shook with silent sobs, but whether they were tears of remorse or self-pity, no one could say. His silence in court was a stark contrast to his dramatic confession, the final act of a performer who had no more lines to say. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. The court clerk's voice was steady as he read the verdict. On 2 counts of kidnapping, guilty. On 2 counts of first-degree murder, guilty. A wave of quiet relief and sorrow washed over the gallery. There was no applause, no celebration. Sarah and Mark Hayes simply closed their eyes and held hands, to solitary figures united in a moment of grim finality. Justice had been served, but it brought no joy. At the sentencing, the judge called Bennett's actions an act of profound and unimaginable evil masked by a facade of public trust, citing the calculated nature of the crime and the decades of deceit. He sentenced Jack Bennett to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom for the last time, Bennett looked towards Sarah and Mark, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod before disappearing through a side door. His public life and his secret one finally over. The verdict was a full stop at the end of a long, terrible sentence, but it was not. Closer, for Sarah and Mark, there could be no such thing. Closer would mean their children were home and safe. The verdict was merely an acknowledgement of the truth they had been forced to live with. It closed the legal chapter, but it could not fill the immense, gaping void that Chloe and Ethan's absence had left in their lives and their hearts. In the aftermath, Chloe and Ethan Hayes were laid to rest in the Oakhaven Cemetery under a simple, granite headstone that read, "Together Forever." The entire town attended the funeral. It was a service 30 years delayed, a final, heartbreaking goodbye to the two children whose music had once filled the town square. As the first handful of earth was thrown, it was clear that while the case was closed and the killer was caged, the pain would endure. The verdict was justice, but the void remained a silent, permanent echo of a song cut short in the years following the trial. The story of Sonny Jim Franklin became a dark legend, a cautionary tale for a new generation, about the monsters that can hide in plain sight. Reruns of Sonny's Funhouse were never aired again, and his merchandise became a morbid collector's item, traded in the shadowy corners of the internet. The name that once symbolized joy and innocence became synonymous with a chilling, unfathomable betrayal. His legacy was not one of laughter, but of a lie that had captivated a nation before it shattered into a million pieces. Jack Bennett died in a prison hospital less than a year after his sentencing, succumbing to the pancreatic cancer that had prompted his confession. He died alone, an anonymous inmate stripped of both his celebrated persona and his secret identity. There was no fanfare, no primetime special to mark his passing. His death was a quiet, pathetic end to a life built on a foundation of deceit and stolen light. For the world, it was a footnote. For the families he destroyed, it was simply the final, quiet closing of a monstrous chapter. Captain Miles Corbin retired from the Vermont State Police. 2 months after the verdict, the Hayes case, his white whale, was finally put to rest. The box of evidence returned to the archives, not as an unsolved mystery, but as a closed case. Yet, the resolution brought him little peace. He had fulfilled his promise, but the faces of Chloe and Ethan, forever young in the faded photographs, haunted him still. He had brought their killer to justice, but he couldn't undo the crime or erase the 30 years of pain their family had endured. The silence of their absence was a sound he knew he would hear for the rest of his life. Oakhaven, Vermont, was forever changed. The annual Founders' Day festival continued, but a shadow lingered over the celebration. The small wooden stage in the town square was eventually rebuilt, but no one could look at it without thinking of the two children who had given their last performance there. A small bronze plaque was placed at its base, bearing the names Chloe and Ethan Hayes and a simple inscription, "Your melody lives on in our hearts." The town's innocence, lost in 1990, never fully returned. A new, more cautious generation of parents held their children's hands a little tighter. Mark Hayes moved away from Oakhaven after the funeral. The town held too many ghosts, too many painful memories. He settled in a quiet coastal town, seeking the solace of the ocean's vast, impersonal roar. He began to play the guitar again, something he hadn't done since his children disappeared. He played not for an audience, but for himself, finding a small measure of peace in the simple act of creation, a quiet tribute to the musical gift his children had shared with the world. Sarah Hayes remained in Oakhaven, in the house where she had raised her children. She found a different kind of purpose. She transformed her advocacy work, creating the Chloe and Ethan's Voice Foundation, an organization dedicated not only to helping find missing children, but also to providing long-term grief counseling and support for the families left behind. She understood, in a way few could, that the end of a search is not the end of the pain. She became a beacon for others, lost in the same fog of grief she had navigated for 3 decades. The silence that had once suffocated her home was now different. It was no longer a void of not knowing, but a space filled with memory. She filled the house with photographs, celebrating the 10 and 12 years of life her children did have. Rather than focusing solely on the years they lost, she could listen to fiddle music again, the sound now a bittersweet reminder of her son's passion, not a trigger for her pain. It was not happiness, not closure, but a form of enduring love, a way to live with the void without letting it consume her completely. The case of the vanished performers left an indelible scar on the landscape of true crime and media culture. It forced a difficult conversation about trust, celebrity, and the masks people wear. It served as a horrifying reminder that the capacity for good and evil can exist within the same person, and that the friendly face on a screen can hide the most terrible of secrets. The public's fascination with the case was a testament to its chilling, almost unbelievable nature, a real-life horror story that played out in their own living rooms. There is no happy ending to a story like this. There is no neat resolution that can mend the shattered pieces of so many lives. There is only the truth, in all its brutal, heartbreaking clarity. The truth is that 2 children, full of music and promise, were stolen from the world by a man who coveted their light. The truth is that a family was broken, a community was scarred, and a detective was haunted for a lifetime. Justice was found, but it could never be a substitute for the lives that were lost. In the quiet cemetery in Oak Haven, the granite headstone of Chloe and Ethan Hayes stands as a silent testament to their story. It is a place of profound sadness, but also of profound love. It marks the end of their lives, but not the end of their story. Their melody, though cut short, continues to echo in the hearts of those who loved them, in the work their mother does in their name, and in the lingering silence of a town that will never forget its 2 little performers.